Neanderthals endured Europe's cold and violent climate shifts long before our species remained there. Then the humans who knew the continent best disappeared, while newcomers who had failed before became the survivors. The evidence reveals no single war and does not prove that every arrival was defeated. It leaves a colder paradox. Did Neanderthals truly defeat every human who entered Europe for 100,000 years? And then, what changed? Europe in the age of Neanderthals was not a single landscape waiting beneath an endless sheet of ice. It was a continent whose boundaries, coastlines, rivers, forests, and open plains changed again and again as the climate moved through colder and warmer phases. Ice sometimes covered large areas of the north, but much of Europe remained beyond the great glaciers. In those exposed regions, the ground could support tundra, dry grassland, scattered woodland, or denser forest, depending on the place and the period. A valley that offered water, shelter, wood, and grazing animals during one generation might become colder, drier, or less productive during another. A route across a plain could open when conditions eased, then narrow when animals shifted their range or snow remained longer through the year. The continent did not merely surround human life. It continually rearranged the possibilities of human life. Neanderthal communities lived within these moving possibilities for an immense span of time. Their world included Atlantic coasts, inland river systems, limestone caves, forest margins, uplands, and broad plains reaching far beyond Western Europe. No single description fits every place they inhabited. Some groups lived near rich animal populations. Others returned to landscapes where food was scattered and seasonal. Some occupied regions during milder intervals, while other evidence places them in severe cold. Their history, therefore, cannot be reduced to the idea that they were creatures made only for snow. They persisted across variation, and persistence required more than physical endurance. It required repeated decisions about where to travel, when to remain, which animals to follow, where stone could be found, and which shelters might still be usable after the weather changed. Long before our own species established itself across Europe, another human lineage had already learned that the continent could never be treated as stable. This matters when considering the origins of the people who later approached from the south and east. Homo sapiens developed in Africa within environments that were also diverse and changeable, and movement had always been central to human survival. Yet movement into Europe was not simply a longer version of an ordinary journey. New arrivals would have crossed ecological thresholds where familiar plants became rarer, daylight changed with the seasons, winters demanded different planning, and prey followed routes learned over generations. The landscape contained no signs explaining which valley would remain safe or which plain would become empty. Knowledge had to be gathered slowly, often through consequences that left no trace in bone or stone. Neanderthals did not possess perfect knowledge, and the climate could threaten them as severely as anyone else. But their presence was rooted in countless earlier returns to the same regions. A cave was more than an opening in rock if people knew when smoke would collect inside it, where water could be reached, and what animals passed nearby. A river crossing was more than a shallow place if its dangers changed after thaw or heavy rain. These forms of understanding were not preserved as maps. They were carried through attention, memory, teaching, and repeated use. When a community vanished, some of that knowledge may have vanished with it. When a community endured, the landscape became slightly less unknown to the next generation. Europe, before the lasting arrival of Homo sapiens, was therefore neither empty nor uniformly hostile. It was occupied thinly, unevenly, and intelligently by humans whose beginnings belonged to a different branch of our shared evolutionary past. The first members of our own lineage who reached its edges were not stepping into vacant territory. That familiarity could not command the weather or prevent hunger, but it could quietly reduce uncertainty, preserving small, practical lessons whose value became visible only when seasons shifted and familiar ground began to change once more. They were entering a changing continent already interpreted by other minds, and the oldest advantage there may not have been strength, but familiarity. For many generations, Neanderthals lived across a region stretching from Western Europe into Central Asia. Their presence was never uniform, and the archaeological record does not show unbroken occupation of every valley or plain. Communities appeared, withdrew, disappeared locally, and returned when conditions became favorable. Yet across these interruptions, the Neanderthal lineage endured. That endurance did not come from immunity to cold or from a body that could survive without planning. It came from a long relationship between human biology, learned behavior, and landscapes that changed faster than inherited adaptation could answer. Their bodies were compact and powerfully built, features often associated with conserving heat and supporting demanding movement. But strength carried energetic costs. Muscle required food, winter reduced resources, and injuries could make travel dangerous. Survival depended on more than physical form. It depended on knowing how to use fire, shape stone, approach animals, recognize useful places, and maintain cooperation among people whose numbers were often small. Archaeology cannot recover every lesson passed between generations, yet tools, butchered bones, hearths, residues, and shelters show lives organized through practical knowledge rather than instinct alone. Neanderthals hunted large animals in many regions, but they were not bound to one menu. Evidence from sites suggests diets that varied with local opportunities, including smaller animals and plants. Such flexibility mattered because Europe offered no guarantee. A productive hunting ground could lose its herds. A familiar woodland could open into grassland. A route linking two communities could become harder to cross, leaving people isolated when exchange, assistance, or new family ties were needed. Their achievement was not that they conquered these changes, it was that enough communities repeatedly adjusted to them for the lineage to continue. This endurance also reaches toward the beginning of our shared human story. Neanderthals were not outsiders unrelated to us, but members of a neighboring human lineage descended from ancient populations that shared deeper ancestry with Homo sapiens. Over time, separation across regions allowed bodies and populations to follow different evolutionary paths. Europe and Western Eurasia became central to Neanderthal history, while the earliest development of our own species took place in Africa. These histories followed separate paths for long periods, but they were never destined to remain separate forever. When groups belonging to Homo sapiens moved north and west, they approached lands where another kind of human had already survived, environmental reversals that had removed local populations before them. Familiarity did not make Neanderthals invulnerable. Genetic evidence and settlement patterns indicate that many communities were small, often widely separated, and vulnerable to losses that a larger population might absorb. A failed hunt, illness, the death of a skilled adult, or lost contact with neighboring groups could carry consequences across a generation. We cannot know the private grief or decisions behind those events, and the evidence does not permit us to reconstruct individual stories. What can be seen is a wider rhythm of contraction and return. Neanderthal occupation sometimes followed changing habitats, with people abandoning areas that became unsuitable and later recolonizing them. Endurance, therefore, did not always mean remaining in one place. Sometimes it meant moving away before a place became fatal, preserving enough people and knowledge to begin elsewhere. This was the human world that earlier arrivals from our lineage encountered near Europe. It was not guarded by a united population, and there is no evidence of a continent organized for war. Instead, it was occupied by scattered communities whose advantage had accumulated quietly through time. They knew materials, seasons, animals, shelters, and routes within regions because earlier generations had paid the cost of learning them. Newcomers could possess intelligence, language, cooperation, and technical skill of their own, yet still face a simple imbalance. They had to discover what established communities already practiced. Before any imagined contest between two human forms, there was this difference in historical depth. One had arrived, while the other had already endured. When the first members of Homo sapiens approached Europe, they were not moving toward an untouched continent. They were entering landscapes already used, remembered, and revisited by Neanderthal communities. The signs of that occupation would not have resembled borders, roads, or permanent villages. Most traces were temporary: a hearth darkened by repeated fires, broken animal bones near a shelter, flakes of stone beside a river, or pathways followed because water and prey returned there. Yet temporary traces can belong to a long human history. A valley may hold no people on a particular morning and still form part of a territory known across generations. A cave may stand empty for years and remain connected to seasonal movement. The absence of buildings did not mean the absence of ownership. memory, or risk. Although archaeology cannot tell us exactly how Neanderthals understood those ideas, new arrivals from our lineage would have faced this older human presence unevenly. Some regions may have contained nearby Neanderthal groups, while others may have been empty because climate, prey, or population decline had pushed them away. There was probably no clear frontier where one kind of human world ended and another began. Instead, occupation shifted across a broad mosaic of rivers, uplands, coasts, grasslands, and wooded refuges. A small group could enter without meeting anyone directly, yet still depend on animals, stone sources, and shelters that other humans already knew how to use. Competition did not require a battle. It could begin whenever two populations needed the same narrow passage, the same winter refuge, or the same migrating herds. The newcomers carried their own inherited knowledge from Africa and Western Asia. They were not biologically unprepared for thought, cooperation, or invention. Some early Homo sapiens endured cold environments, made complex tools, and moved through unfamiliar territory with considerable skill. But intelligence alone could not supply local experience instantly. The first winter in a region was different from the 20th. A group arriving after a favorable season might mistake temporary abundance for a dependable pattern. Animals that seemed plentiful could move beyond reach. Fuel could become scarce. Snow, rainfall, darkness, and distance could separate people from neighboring communities at the moment when contact mattered most. These problems return us to the beginning of our species, because human expansion was never simply the movement of bodies across a map. It was the movement of social knowledge into places where that knowledge had to be tested again. People survived through relationships that extended beyond a single hunter or household. They needed children to reach adulthood, adults to find partners, skills to pass between generations, and communities to recover after injury or hunger. A group might leave tools and bones behind, yet fail to establish descendants who remained in the region. Its arrival would then appear in the earth as a brief human presence, rather than the beginning of permanent settlement. This possibility changes the meaning of the title's claim. Neanderthals did not need to defeat every newcomer through direct violence for early expansions to fail. Their advantage could have been quieter. Greater familiarity with particular landscapes, longer continuity in local networks, and fewer unknowns during difficult seasons. Even that advantage was never absolute. Neanderthal groups could disappear from regions, lose contact, or suffer the same environmental pressures that challenge newcomers. The evidence does not reveal a single contest with a clear winner. It reveals several human populations moving through unstable space, sometimes separated, sometimes overlapping, and eventually meeting closely enough for genes to pass between them. Europe was therefore not conquered in one entrance. It was approached repeatedly, occupied uncertainly, and learned at a cost. Each unsuccessful attempt may also have carried useful lessons, although archaeology rarely shows whether later travellers inherited them or began again without that memory. Long before our lineage became dominant there, the continent tested whether intelligence brought from elsewhere could become knowledge rooted in place. The movement of Homo sapiens beyond Africa did not begin as a single march toward Europe. It unfolded through many journeys made by small populations over long periods, under climates that repeatedly opened and closed routes through northeastern Africa, Arabia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Fossils, stone tools, sediments, and genetic evidence do not all preserve the same moments, and they do not support a simple line drawn from one homeland to one destination. Some groups reach regions beyond Africa earlier than the populations that later contributed most of the ancestry of living people outside the continent. Their presence may have lasted for generations, perhaps much longer, yet many of these early expansions left little or no clear genetic continuation in later populations. To arrive somewhere was not necessarily to remain there. Africa itself was never one uniform setting from which a fully formed people suddenly departed. Our species developed within a continent of deserts, grasslands, forests, coasts, highlands, lakes, and river systems. Populations were separated and reconnected as rainfall and vegetation changed. Ideas, genes, and ways of living could move between communities without every community moving together. The beginning of Homo sapiens is therefore better understood as a long African history involving population structure, contact, and repeated adaptation, rather than the appearance of one isolated group that already possessed every later advantage. Movement beyond the continent continued this older pattern. People followed water, animals, shorelines, valleys, and habitable corridors. But no route remained dependable forever. A wetter interval could turn dry country into a chain of usable habitats. When aridity returned, the same passage could fragment into distant refuges, leaving small groups separated from the people behind them and from one another. Such separation mattered because human survival depended on more than reaching food. A population also needed enough social contact for knowledge, partnership, care, and reproduction to continue across generations. Early travelers carried skills shaped in African environments, including cooperation, flexible food gathering, and the ability to make tools from local materials. These capacities made expansion possible, but they did not remove uncertainty. New plants required recognition. New animals behaved differently. Seasonal darkness, cold, and unfamiliar disease environments created pressures that could not be solved by intelligence in the abstract. Every landscape had to be learned through experience, and some lessons may have been purchased with injury, hunger, or the disappearance of a community. The archaeological record preserves only scattered remains of these attempts. A jaw, a tooth, a collection of stone flakes, or a footprint can demonstrate that people reached a region, but it cannot by itself reveal how many arrived, how long they stayed, or why their descendants did not continue there. This silence is important for the question of Europe. Long before Homo sapiens became widespread across that continent, members of our species had already moved into neighbouring regions of Western Asia. There, changing environments brought them into regions that Neanderthals also occupied at other times. The boundary between Africa and Eurasia was not a gate crossed once. It was a broad and shifting zone through which populations could advance, retreat, meet, and sometimes mix. What later appears as a successful expansion was built upon a deeper history of movements that did not all lead to permanent settlement. Describing those earlier arrivals as failures would be too simple, because survival is measured differently at the scale of a lifetime and at the scale of ancestry. A group could live, raise children, and understand a new country, yet still disappear from the genetic future through isolation, absorption, or chance. Nothing in that outcome requires a decisive battle. It reveals how easily a human presence can be real in its own time and almost invisible in ours. Before our lineage established itself in Europe, it had already crossed thresholds many times, but crossing was only the beginning of the test, and beyond each newly opened horizon waited uncertainty. Between Africa and Europe lay a region that was neither a simple bridge nor a permanent border. Western Asia, especially the lands around the eastern Mediterranean, contained coastlines, uplands, river valleys, deserts, and wooded zones compressed within a relatively narrow area. As rainfall and temperature changed, these environments expanded, contracted, and connected in different ways. A wetter interval could support grass, trees, fresh water, and grazing animals across country that later became dry and difficult to cross. A colder phase could shift habitats southward, while warmer conditions might allow populations adapted to different settings to move north. For Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, this region was therefore less like a doorway opened once than a frontier that seemed to breathe. It admitted movement during favourable periods, then divided communities when conditions worsened. Fossils from caves in the Levant show that both human lineages occupied parts of this wider region, although not necessarily at the same sites or at the same moments. The sequence is incomplete, and the dates remain subjects of continuing refinement. Even so, the broad pattern is important. Homo sapiens reached areas beyond Africa long before our species became permanently established across Europe, while Neanderthals also extended south and east from their better-known European range. Their territories were not fixed blocks on a map. They changed with habitats, prey, population size, and the practical ability of small communities to maintain contact. At one time, a wooded corridor may have favoured people moving out of Africa. At another, cooler or drier conditions may have favoured Neanderthal occupation farther south. These shifts should not be imagined as orderly exchanges in which one population departed before another arrived. Archaeological layers preserve fragments, not a complete calendar of who stood in every valley. Groups may have lived far apart, approached the same regions in different generations, or overlapped without leaving evidence clear enough to identify direct encounters. The frontier could contain contact, avoidance, replacement, and absence within the same broad span of history. This landscape connects directly to the beginning of Homo sapiens, because every movement away from Africa depended on more than curiosity or technical ability. Populations needed corridors containing water, food, shelter, and other people. A route could be geographically open yet socially fragile. A small group moving north might survive for years but lose connection with communities behind it. Without continuing movement, new partners, exchange knowledge, or support after local losses, its presence could gradually narrow. Neanderthal groups face similar dangers, but those already established in Western Eurasia could draw upon networks and experience rooted on the northern side of the frontier. This did not guarantee victory. It simply meant that climatic change did not affect both populations from the same starting position. The region also complicates the idea of two completely separate humanities. Genetic evidence shows that ancestors of later people outside Africa exchanged genes with Neanderthals, demonstrating that some meetings involved reproduction rather than simple exclusion. Yet genetic inheritance cannot tell us how every encounter unfolded, and it does not mean that all communities mixed equally. Some contacts may have been brief. Others may have joined families or absorbed isolated newcomers. Many left no identifiable trace. The frontier preserved possibilities rather than one repeated outcome. Every advance depended on conditions no community controlled, and every retreat could erase knowledge gained during a brief interval of abundance. For early Homo sapiens, reaching Western Asia proved that movement beyond Africa was possible. It did not prove that Europe could yet be occupied securely. Beyond the eastern Mediterranean lay longer winters, unbeaten ecological rhythms, and a continent whose established human population had already survived repeated contractions. The Near East was therefore a testing ground where ranges touched and withdrew. It showed that our lineage could enter the wider Neanderthal world, but it also revealed the difference between crossing into that world and building a chain of generations strong enough to remain. Some of the earliest Homo sapiens in Europe did not become the founders of the populations that spread across the continent. Their bones and tools show that they arrived, sometimes far inside regions long associated with Neanderthals, yet genetic evidence suggests that several of these early groups left little lasting ancestry in Europeans. This does not mean that their lives were brief or meaningless. A community could survive for many generations, raise children, learn rivers and valleys, and still disappear from the longer record. At the scale of a human lifetime, such a population might have seemed established. At the scale of thousands of years, it could become almost invisible. The difference between arrival and continuity is central to the question of why earlier movements into Europe did not immediately lead to lasting occupation. Small populations carry risks that have little to do with intelligence or courage. If only a few families enter a new region, the death of several adults can alter the future of the entire group. A harsh winter may remove experienced hunters. An accident may take someone who knows where stone, fuel, or shelter can be found. Children may survive, but later struggle to find partners beyond close relatives. Contact with distant communities may weaken as routes become dangerous or habitats shift. No single disaster is required. A population can decline through losses accumulating faster than new people arrive. This possibility also changes how we imagine contact with Neanderthals. Direct conflict may have occurred at times, as it has among many human societies, but archaeology does not reveal a continent filled with continuous warfare between two separated peoples. Newcomers could fail even without being attacked. They might enter during a favourable climatic interval, then face colder or drier conditions after the corridor behind them closed. They might compete indirectly for animals, shelters, or raw materials already used by local groups. They might also join Neanderthal communities through reproduction, leaving descendants whose identity no longer belonged to the arriving population as a separate group. Disappearance can mean death, movement, absorption, or some combination of all three. The beginning of Homo sapiens outside Africa was therefore not a clean succession of victories. It was a series of experiments conducted by communities who could not know whether the land ahead would remain habitable. Their inherited flexibility allowed them to cross unfamiliar country, but every region demanded a stable chain of generations. Knowledge had to survive the people who first acquired it. Children had to inherit not only tools but relationships connecting them to camps. New arrivals had to continue arriving, or isolated groups risked becoming too small to recover from loss. Early Europeans belonging to our species may have lacked that continuing support. Their movements reached deep into the continent, yet their demographic roots remained shallow. Meanwhile, Neanderthal populations, although also small and vulnerable, possessed a longer history of regional return. Their communities could draw upon knowledge that had already passed through many cycles of colder and warmer conditions. This did not make them permanent masters of Europe. It gave them a form of continuity that the earliest newcomers had not yet created. The ground preserves the contrast imperfectly. A few tools may represent a short visit, a repeated seasonal camp, or a population living nearby for years. A single human bone may belong to someone whose relatives continued elsewhere, or to a lineage that soon ended. Scientists must therefore resist turning every archaeological layer into a dramatic conquest or defeat. What can be said more carefully is that early Homo sapiens entered Europe before they established enduring dominance there. Some met Neanderthals closely enough to exchange genes. Some may have retreated. Some vanished into populations that no longer existed as distinct communities. Their failure to remain was not proof of inferiority. It was evidence that reaching Europe and becoming rooted within it were two very different human achievements. To understand what happened when Homo sapiens entered the Neanderthal world, scientists must work with evidence that was never created to answer our questions. Bones preserve fragments of bodies, but usually not complete lives. A skull can reveal anatomy, growth, injury, disease, and sometimes diet, yet it cannot tell us what a person feared, believed, or intended. A broken limb that healed may suggest survival long enough for recovery, but it does not prove who offered help or how care was organized. Teeth can hold chemical traces of food, movement, childhood stress, and local geology, though each result depends on preservation and careful comparison. Even a well-preserved skeleton represents one individual, not an entire population spread across centuries and landscapes. Stone tools offer a different kind of record. Their shape can show how stone was selected, struck, sharpened, reused, and carried. Refitting scattered flakes can sometimes reconstruct a sequence of actions at a campsite. Wear and residues may indicate contact with wood, hide, meat, plants, or other materials, yet a tool cannot identify the thoughts behind its design. Similar objects may have been made by different human populations, while one population could use several techniques. Archaeological labels are useful for organizing patterns, but they must not be mistaken for tribes, languages, or fixed identities. A change in tools may reflect new people, exchange knowledge, local materials, shifting tasks, or choices that remain invisible. Animal bones, hearths, pigments, shells, and worked wood can widen the picture. Cut marks and fractures may reveal butchery and the removal of marrow. Burned material can show the use of fire. The ages and species of hunted animals can help reconstruct behavior and environment. Still, accumulation has many causes. Carnivores, floods, falling rock, later visitors, and natural decay can mix or remove evidence. What appears to be one occupation may contain traces deposited across separate visits. The ground itself, therefore, becomes another witness. Sediment records changes in water, wind, vegetation, fire, temperature, and the movement of material through a cave or open site. Dating methods can place remains within ranges of time, but uncertainty remains, especially when layers have been disturbed. A few centuries of overlap may be difficult to distinguish from alternating occupations separated by generations. This is why claims of meetings, battles, or rapid replacement require more than objects found near one another. DNA has transformed the story most deeply. Genetic material recovered from bones, teeth, and even cave sediment can identify biological relationships, population connections, and interbreeding. It has shown that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were not completely isolated lineages. It can also reveal small communities, close relatives, migration, and ancestry that fossils alone cannot detect. But ancient DNA survives unevenly, especially outside cold conditions. The people whose genomes are recovered form a tiny and geographically biased sample. Genes can show that ancestors met, not what the meeting felt like, whether it was peaceful or how often similar encounters occurred. No category can stand alone. Bones without context may be displaced. Tools without secure dating may be assigned too confidently. Sediment, without human remains, may indicate presence but not identity, and DNA without archaeology may reveal ancestry while leaving behavior unknown. Confidence grows when independent clues agree across methods and sites. It weakens when a conclusion depends upon one unusual object, one uncertain date, or an assumption borrowed from conflict. These limits return us to the origin of the central question. The claim that Neanderthals defeated every human arrival cannot be read directly from a weapon, a skeleton, or a genetic sequence. Science sees discontinuities, brief occupations, changing technologies, inherited DNA, and populations that appear and vanish. From these traces, researchers build explanations and test them against new discoveries. The strongest account is not the one with the most dramatic certainty. It is the one that separates what the ground demonstrates from what human imagination is tempted to place inside the silence. A population does not need to lose a war in order to disappear. For small human communities, the quieter dangers may be more persistent than any battlefield. Imagine several groups living far apart across a changing landscape, each containing only a limited number of adults and children. Most years may pass without catastrophe. People hunt, share food, teach skills, form families, and return to familiar shelters. Yet the future of the population depends upon a narrow balance. Enough children must survive, enough adults must remain healthy. People of suitable ages must meet partners beyond their closest relatives. Separate communities must continue exchanging knowledge and members. When any of these connections weaken, decline can begin without a single dramatic moment. Random events matter more when numbers are small. The death of one skilled person may remove knowledge that nobody else holds completely. Several births of the same sex within one generation may reduce future partnerships. A route blocked by severe weather may separate neighboring groups for years. Illness or injury may not kill everyone, but it can lower the number of people able to gather food, travel, or care for children. In a large population, another community may replace what has been lost. In a scattered population, there may be no nearby reserve. The effects accumulate slowly, and the archaeological record may preserve only the final absence. This is one meaning of demographic failure. It does not describe weaker minds or inferior bodies. It describes the mathematics of continuity, in which survival depends not only on how well individuals live, but on whether enough relationships endure across generations. Researchers have used population models to show that isolation, difficulty finding partners, inbreeding, and ordinary fluctuations in births and deaths could increase the risk of extinction among small groups. These models are not photographs of Neanderthal history. They test whether disappearance is possible under certain assumptions. Their value lies in showing that violence is not required to produce replacement. Their limitation is equally important. Real Neanderthal populations were diverse across space and time, and recent genetic evidence from northwestern Europe indicates that some late communities were more connected and genetically varied than earlier samples had suggested. No single isolated group can represent an entire human lineage. The same demographic logic applies to early Homo sapiens. Entering Europe, a few arrivals could possess effective tools, strong cooperation, and detailed knowledge carried from Western Asia, yet still fail to establish a lasting population. If migration behind them stopped, their numbers could fall after several difficult seasons. Some might retreat. Some might join local Neanderthal communities. Some might leave descendants whose ancestry became absorbed into another population. Others might simply fail to produce enough surviving generations. None of these outcomes would leave the clear signature of defeat imagined in a story of conquest. They would leave scattered tools, occasional bones, uncertain gaps, and genetic lines that ended or changed direction. This returns us to the origins of Homo sapiens, where populations were repeatedly separated and reconnected across Africa before expanding outward. Human success had always depended upon networks larger than one camp. Knowledge, partners, and assistance moved through those networks, allowing local losses to be repaired. When a migrating group crossed beyond the reach of that support, intelligence alone could not guarantee continuity. Neanderthals faced the same fundamental condition. but earlier in Europe they may often have possessed deeper local connections than the newcomers. To say they defeated an arrival may therefore describe only the visible result. One population remained while another did not. Beneath that result may have been climate, chance, distance, competition, absorption, and the fragile arithmetic of generations. Its disappearance becomes visible later, when continuity can no longer return again. A population can vanish quietly enough that no survivor knows a final day has arrived, because the ending may be nothing more dramatic than the last children failing to form another enduring community. For a long stretch of prehistory, the presence of Homo sapiens near Europe seems to flicker rather than grow steadily. Fossils and tools show that members of our species reached Western Asia and areas of southeastern Europe at different times. Yet these arrivals did not immediately become a continuous occupation spreading from one generation to the next. A site may preserve evidence of people for a limited interval, followed by layers in which their presence is no longer visible. Elsewhere, human remains appear without enough material to show whether a large community lived nearby or whether only a few travellers passed through. The record resembles scattered light separated by darkness, but that darkness must be treated carefully. An empty layer does not prove that no humans lived anywhere in the surrounding region. Erosion may remove deposits. Later activity may disturb them. Small populations may leave traces too faint to survive. Even so, the broad pattern suggests that reaching the edge of Europe was easier than maintaining a dense and enduring population within it. Earlier Homo sapiens groups entered a world in which climate repeatedly changed the value of every route. A corridor that supported movement during a mild interval could become dry, cold, or ecologically broken. When the path behind a small population closed, new arrivals might stop. The people already present would then depend upon their own numbers, local knowledge, and connections across unfamiliar ground. If neighbouring groups were distant, one difficult generation could weaken the social network needed to replace losses. Neanderthals were vulnerable to the same forces, but in many European regions their history reached farther back. Their recurring presence suggests that some communities knew where to withdraw during difficult phases and where to return when habitats improved. This was not permanent control. It was continuity renewed through movement, memory, and survival. The contrast with early Homo sapiens may therefore have been less about superior ability than about the depth and reliability of population routes. Genetic evidence adds another layer to the silence. Some early modern humans in Europe belonged to populations that contributed little or no ancestry to later Europeans. Others carried signs of recent Neanderthal ancestors, proving that contact sometimes led to reproduction. These discoveries do not reveal one simple sequence in which newcomers arrived, fought, and disappeared. They reveal several populations with different histories, some ending, some mixing, and some leaving descendants far from the places where their bones were found. The disappearance of a genetic lineage does not tell us whether its members died locally, moved elsewhere, or were absorbed into a larger community. It only shows that their ancestry did not continue in the same recognizable form. This uncertainty returns us to the beginnings of our species and to the repeated expansions that preceded lasting settlement. Homo sapiens had already demonstrated an ability to cross deserts, coasts, uplands, and unfamiliar ecological boundaries. Yet a species does not occupy a continent through one successful journey. Occupation requires enough people to remain connected across distance, enough children to sustain future generations, and enough movement to repair local losses. For a long time, those conditions may not have aligned in Europe. The continent could receive visitors without becoming their permanent home. Neanderthals could continue without defeating them in any visible war. The archaeological silence between early arrivals and later expansion is therefore not an empty waiting room before an inevitable triumph. It contains human lives whose outcomes remain never fully recoverable. Something would eventually alter the pattern, allowing Homo sapiens to appear across wider regions with greater continuity. But the ground does not point to a single moment when Europe changed hands. For many communities, the answer appears to have been no, though never simply. Before that transition, there was only a repeated question asked by each arriving population. Could movement become belonging before climate, distance, chance, or another human presence broke the chain again? Strength in a Neanderthal body was useful only when enough energy could be found to maintain it. Muscle, bone, movement, warmth, growth, pregnancy, and recovery all required food, and the amount needed would have changed with age, sex, season, activity, health, and climate. Scientists have proposed different estimates for Neanderthal energy use, but those estimates depend on uncertain reconstructions of body mass and daily behavior. The safest conclusion is not that every Neanderthal consumed a fixed, extraordinary amount. It is that a compact, muscular person living an active life in demanding conditions could not remain strong without reliable nourishment. A successful hunt might support a group for days, while repeated failure could turn physical power into a costly burden. Large animals provided valuable meat and fat, but approaching them carried danger. Wooden spears and damaged animal bones from some sites are consistent with hunting at close range, although one method cannot be assigned to every place or period. Near a large animal, speed and strength mattered, but so did timing, terrain, teamwork, and judgment. An animal that escaped could waste hours of effort. One that turned could break a limb or open a wound. Even a small injury could become serious when people had to walk, carry, cut, gather fuel, and keep pace with a moving community. Neanderthal skeletons contain healed fractures and other signs of trauma, yet comparisons do not show that they were uniquely injured when set beside early Homo sapiens from later periods. Their lives were physically demanding, but the old image of reckless hunters constantly wounded by prey is too simple. Risk also existed away from hunting. Stone cutting could damage hands. Smoke could irritate eyes and lungs. Cold water, unstable slopes, falling rock, and long travel could test bodies already weakened by hunger. Teeth were sometimes used as tools, placing additional wear upon them. Childbirth, childhood illness, and the ordinary infections of small wounds added dangers that bones preserve only unevenly. Survival therefore depended upon reducing risk before strength was needed. Choosing a route, watching weather, sharing food, maintaining fire, and recognizing when not to pursue an animal could protect more energy than physical effort could replace. This brings the story back to the beginning of human expansion. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals both descended from populations whose survival depended on cooperation. Neither lineage could rely upon a powerful individual for long. Children needed years of protection and teaching. Injured adults could remain valuable because they carried knowledge, social ties, and practiced skills, but only if others helped them through periods when they could contribute less. A community that shared food and labor could preserve experience that would otherwise disappear with one accident. The body therefore functioned within a wider social system. Strength increased what a person might accomplish, while cooperation determined whether that strength could be renewed after failure. This balance may have favored Neanderthals in landscapes they knew well. Familiar hunting places could reduce wasted movement. Knowledge of seasonal animals could make energy returns more predictable. Established ties between neighboring groups could provide partners, information, or temporary support. Yet the same dependence created vulnerability. If prey declined, routes closed, or neighboring communities vanished, a muscular body still required nourishment. If several capable adults were injured or lost, a small group could struggle to replace their work. Earlier Homo sapiens entering Europe faced comparable dangers, but often without generations of local experience. Their challenge was not to overpower stronger bodies. It was to secure energy, avoid injury, and maintain enough cooperation for children and knowledge to survive unfamiliar seasons. Neanderthal strength was real, but it operated inside a narrow human economy in which every advantage had to be fed, protected, taught, and carried forward. When that economy weakened, strength could not store itself for the future, and no powerful skeleton could replace the missing web of food, care, memory, and renewed human contact between communities. A skeleton can reveal how a body grew, moved, and suffered, but it cannot contain the full knowledge that allowed a community to remain in one landscape. Much of Neanderthal survival existed outside bone. It was held in remembered routes, repeated tasks, shared attention, and the practical understanding of places that changed with season and climate. A stone source mattered because someone knew where it lay, how far it was from water, and whether the journey could be made before weather closed the way. A cave mattered because people knew when it remained dry, where smoke gathered, and which animals passed nearby. A river mattered differently in summer, winter, flood, and thaw. None of this knowledge fossilized directly. Archaeology sees only its effects in the movement of materials, the reuse of locations, and the organization of activities across space. Stone carried away from its natural source shows that people planned beyond the point where it was collected. Sometimes raw material traveled considerable distances, although distance alone cannot tell us whether one person carried it, several groups exchanged it, or a tool moved through repeated journeys. The important point is that useful stone had a history before it was discarded. It had been recognized, selected, shaped, transported, resharpened, and sometimes used until little remained. Wooden objects, plant fibers, hides, adhesives, and containers were less likely to survive, yet rare finds and residues show that Neanderthal technology extended far beyond the durable flakes that dominate museum displays. Fire also belonged to this world of practiced knowledge. Maintaining it required suitable fuel, protection from wind and moisture, and attention to when embers might be preserved. Evidence suggests that Neanderthals used fire repeatedly, and may in some contexts have produced it, but no single method can be assumed for every population or period. Fire provided heat and light, helped process food and materials, and changed how people could use shelters. Still, it was not an automatic possession. A community had to gather fuel, control smoke, and renew the flame after movement or loss. These abilities connect Neanderthals to the deeper origins of human dependence on culture. Our ancestors did not survive by anatomy alone. Human bodies became increasingly reliant on information learned from others, information too detailed and local to be inherited through genes. A child could not discover every dangerous crossing, useful plant, stone source, animal path, and seasonal refuge independently. Knowledge had to pass between generations through observation, participation, correction, gesture, and forms of communication that archaeology cannot fully recover. Neanderthals almost certainly learned socially, but the evidence does not reveal exactly how they taught or how much variation existed among communities. Their long occupation of Western Eurasia nevertheless suggests repeated transmission of skills strong enough to outlast individuals. This was a quiet advantage over newcomers. Homo sapiens entering Europe carried their own traditions and flexible intelligence, but local information could not be imported complete from another region. A tool-making method might travel easily compared with knowledge of when a particular valley flooded or where prey moved after an early snowfall. New arrivals had to build that understanding while feeding children and maintaining contact with distant allies. Neanderthals did not know every landscape perfectly, and climate could make inherited knowledge obsolete. A remembered route could become useless. A prey pattern could change. A stone source could lie beyond an abandoned territory. Tradition helped only when people could revise it. Their endurance therefore points not to mechanical repetition, but to a capacity for adjustment within familiar worlds. When a group disappeared, its invisible map of the land could disappear as well, leaving later travelers to relearn dangers that no surviving artifact could fully explain. The strongest inheritance was not stored in muscle or skull shape. It lived between people, in lessons renewed through use, and it could survive only as long as communities remained connected enough to remember, test, and pass it onward. A stone tool can look simple after tens of thousands of years have stripped away the hands, materials, and decisions that once surrounded it. A flake with a sharp edge may appear to be only a broken piece of rock, yet producing and using it required a sequence of choices. Someone had to recognize suitable stone, select a core, understand how force would travel through it, strike at an angle that removed a useful piece, and judge whether the edge suited cutting meat, scraping hide, shaping wood, or another task. None of these actions proves abstract intelligence by itself, but together they reveal practiced skill. Neanderthal technology was not one frozen tradition repeated without thought. Tool forms varied across regions and periods, responding to available stone, intended use, mobility, and habits learned within communities. Some implements were resharpened until little remained, suggesting that useful objects were maintained rather than discarded casually. Others were carried away from the places where their raw material originated, showing that decisions extended beyond the immediate moment. A tool could therefore contain a small map of future needs. It might be made before an animal was found, transported to another location, repaired after use, and finally abandoned when its edge could no longer be renewed. The ordinary nature of such objects is precisely what makes them important. Survival did not depend on rare masterpieces. It depended on thousands of competent actions performed correctly enough, often under cold, hunger, fatigue, and limited daylight. Evidence also shows that Neanderthals worked more than stone. Rare preservation and microscopic traces point to shaped wood, processed hides, plant fibers, adhesives, bone objects, and composite tools in at least some settings. A stone point attached to a wooden shaft demanded several materials that behaved differently. The maker needed a suitable point, a shaft of useful size, a binding or adhesive, and a method for joining them securely. Producing cord from inner bark fibers required gathering, separating, twisting, and combining strands in an ordered process. These finds should not be used to claim that every Neanderthal group possessed identical techniques. They show instead that the surviving stone record is only the durable remainder of a much broader technical world. This matters to the central question of why earlier Homo sapiens arrivals did not immediately establish themselves in Europe. Newcomers brought their own tool traditions, and there is no basis for treating them as incapable or mechanically inferior. The challenge was whether their knowledge worked reliably in unfamiliar landscapes. A cutting edge is useful everywhere, but the best local stone, the right wood for a shaft, the season when bark separates easily, and the place where fuel remains dry must be learned region by region. Neanderthal communities often possess that local history. Their tools were not weapons in a permanent war for the continent. They belonged to a wider practical system linking memory, material, movement, and cooperation. Even a familiar design could be adjusted when stone quality changed or a different task arose. Skill lived not only in the finished object, but in the ability to notice failure and correct it. This returns us to the deeper origin of human culture. No individual could independently rediscover every method needed for survival. Children learned by watching, handling materials, attempting actions, and receiving guidance whose exact form remains unknown. Adults inherited techniques, modified them, and passed them onward. The apparent simplicity of many Neanderthal tools, therefore, should not be confused with simplicity of mind. Their value lay in dependable performance, not visual display. A well-made flake that opened a hide, prepared meat, or shaped a wooden implement could protect energy and time during a difficult season. Europe was not held through one extraordinary invention. It was inhabited through repeated technical competence, renewed each day by people who understood that an ordinary tool could stand between a community and the slow accumulation of failure each season. Neanderthals did not live in one landscape, follow one animal, or eat one unchanging diet. Their range stretched across environments that differed sharply in temperature, vegetation, altitude, rainfall, and available prey. In some northern and open settings, large grazing animals formed a major role in subsistence. Cut marks, broken bones, hunting damage, and chemical evidence from human remains often point towards substantial use of meat. Yet this pattern cannot be expanded into a claim that every Neanderthal depended only on large mammals. Along Mediterranean coasts, in wooded regions, and in places where smaller animals or plant foods were accessible, the surviving evidence reveals other choices. Shellfish, tortoises, rabbits, birds, seeds, nuts, mushrooms, and starchy plants appear in different records, although preservation is uneven, and the importance of each food remains difficult to measure. A meal leaves a weaker archaeological signature than a stone tool, especially when plants, eggs, marrow, fat, or small animals are consumed without durable remains. What survives, therefore, tends to emphasize large bones and hard materials, while softer traces of life disappear. Even stable isotope studies, valuable as they are, mostly reflect the protein portion of diet and can miss many plant foods. The safest picture is not of unlimited variety, but of regional adjustment. Neanderthal communities used what local environments offered, and those opportunities changed through time. A group living near cold grassland could organize movement around herds. People near a coast could collect marine resources when tides, seasons, and access allowed. In forested country, hunting visibility, animal distribution, fuel, and edible plants differed from those on an exposed plain. Toolkits, travel patterns, and the use of shelters could shift with these conditions. Archaeological differences between sites do not automatically represent different species, separate levels of intelligence, or fixed cultural identities. They may reflect different tasks, seasons, resources, and histories of occupation. Flexibility did not mean that every community could solve every environmental problem. Knowledge was local, and adaptation had limits. If a preferred animal disappeared, another resource might not provide equal energy. If woodland expanded, hunting methods effective on open ground might become less useful. A coastal food source could be seasonal or dangerous to reach. A population already weakened by low numbers could understand several foods and still fail to gather enough of them. The capacity to change reduced risk, but it did not remove dependence on weather, population size, and inherited experience. This matters when returning to the origin and expansion of Homo sapiens. Newcomers entering Europe also possessed flexible diets and technologies, formed through a long history in Africa and Western Asia. The difference was not that one humanity could adapt while the other could not. Both lineages adjusted behavior to local opportunities. Neanderthals, however, had often repeated those adjustments within European regions across many generations. They knew not only that an animal could be eaten, but where it moved, when it became difficult to find, and what other resources might appear nearby. Such knowledge could make a varied diet dependable rather than accidental. It could also be lost when communities disappeared or became isolated. The image of Neanderthals as specialized hunters unable to respond to change is therefore too narrow, just as the image of perfect ecological masters is too generous. Their endurance came from flexibility operating within limits. They shifted among landscapes, materials, and foods without escaping the basic human problem of uncertainty. Earlier Homo sapiens arrivals did not confront a population trapped in one old way of life. They entered regions inhabited by people capable of altering daily practice while preserving knowledge rooted in place. The contest, where competition existed at all, was not between adaptability and stagnation. It was between different networks of adaptable humans, each trying to turn changing resources into enough continuity for another generation. Their survival depended on whether that adjustment remained fast enough, shared widely enough, and supported by landscapes that still provided food. The disappearance of one human population and the survival of another cannot be explained by placing two brains on an imaginary scale. Neanderthals were often described as mentally limited, while Homo sapiens were presented as the first humans capable of true planning, symbolism, or flexible thought. Archaeology has weakened that division. Neanderthals made varied tools, controlled fire, hunted cooperatively, processed many materials, used pigments in some settings, and adapted to landscapes that changed repeatedly. None of these observations proves that their minds were identical to ours. The structure and development of their brains cannot be reconstructed from artifacts alone, yet the evidence is sufficient to reject the idea that they disappeared because they lacked human intelligence. Intelligence is not a substance that automatically produces population growth. A skilled person may understand weather, animals, stone, and shelter, but still belong to a community too small to recover from several deaths. A group may invent an effective technique, yet lose it when the people who know it become isolated or die before teaching enough children. Another group may use simpler tools but remain connected to relatives who bring partners, food, and information during difficult years. At the level preserved by evolution, continuity depends not only on what individuals can think, but on how knowledge and people move through a population. This distinction matters for Homo sapiens entering Europe. They did not arrive carrying a cognitive advantage that guaranteed possession of the continent. Some reached cold environments, produced capable technologies, and met Neanderthals closely enough for interbreeding. Several early lineages nevertheless failed to contribute substantially to later populations. Their minds had not failed. The chain linking one generation to the next had failed to remain visible. Distance, climate, small numbers, interrupted migration, competition, absorption, and random loss could weaken that chain without changing anyone's capacity for thought. Neanderthals had endured similar pressures longer, but endurance did not prove mental superiority either. Their regional familiarity and inherited practices helped them persist, while their populations could still contract, fragment, and disappear locally. The comparison becomes misleading whenever survival is treated as a contest between a clever species and a dull one. Evolution does not award continuity to the most intelligent individual. It preserves lineages whose members reproduce, maintain connections, and survive enough unpredictable events for ancestry to continue. Even a slight demographic difference repeated across many generations can produce a large result. Continuing arrivals from one region may replace losses, while a population without comparable reinforcement gradually becomes a smaller share of the whole. Models show that repeated migration alone can contribute to replacement even without assuming that one population possessed an absolute biological advantage. Such models do not prove exactly what happened, but they reveal how little dramatic superiority is required. This returns us to the deeper beginning of humanity. Homo sapiens developed within connected and divided African populations, where contact repeatedly moved genes, skills, and people across changing environments. What our lineage carried into Eurasia may have included not one decisive invention, but a history of population movement capable of renewing local human communities. That possibility will matter later, but it should not be treated as the answer before all evidence is considered. Neanderthals also maintained relationships beyond single camps, and genetic findings warn against imagining every late community as equally isolated. The difference between the populations may have shifted across regions and centuries. Intelligence allowed both to notice, remember, cooperate, and adjust. It could not command rainfall, guarantee births, reopen a blocked route, or replace absent neighbours. The eventual outcome, therefore, cannot be read as a ranking of human worth. It arose from thinking bodies embedded in climates, landscapes, families, and networks whose scale changed through time. To ask which humanity was smarter may be to ask the wrong question. The quieter question is which population could keep enough minds connected for long enough that knowledge, children, and ancestry continued together. Climate in Pleistocene Europe did not always change at a pace too slow for people to notice. Ice cores, marine sediments, pollen, and cave deposits show that the last glacial period included abrupt shifts as well as longer trends. Temperatures, rainfall, winds, and vegetation could alter over decades or centuries, although the timing and strength of each change differed by region. A person might not witness a continent transform, but a community could experience winters becoming longer, forests thinning, grasslands spreading, or familiar animals appearing less often within remembered generations. The knowledge passed down by grandparents could remain valuable while no longer matching the landscape exactly. Such change did not announce itself as a permanent new climate. Several difficult seasons might be followed by improvement, encouraging people to remain until another reversal made the old decision costly. For Neanderthals, who had endured repeated climatic cycles, flexibility was essential. Communities could shift their movements, use different prey, or withdraw toward areas where water, shelter, and food remained available. Southern peninsulas, river valleys, coastal zones, and protected uplands sometimes offered refuges, but no refuge was equally safe in every period. Local studies also show that some Neanderthal occupations occurred under relatively stable conditions, even while wider climate records were variable. Europe cannot therefore be treated as one synchronized environment. A severe event in the north might have weaker effects farther south, while a regional drought or vegetation shift could damage one population without changing another in the same way. This unevenness shaped contact with Homo sapiens. A route into Europe might open when rainfall supported plants and animals along Western Asian corridors. New groups could follow expanding habitats into southeastern or central regions. If conditions changed after their arrival, the route connecting them to populations behind them could weaken. Their descendants would then face Europe with fewer incoming partners, fewer exchanged materials, and less help replacing local losses. Neanderthals could also become isolated when habitats fragmented, but their longer regional history may sometimes have provided alternative routes and remembered refuges unavailable to newcomers. That advantage remained conditional. When change exceeded what local knowledge could answer, familiarity itself could become misleading. A valley known for prey might no longer receive migrating herds. A cave used through many seasons might become too distant from fuel or water. The problem was not merely surviving colder air, it was preserving a connected human population while the geography of useful places was being rearranged. This returns the story to the origins of Homo sapiens, because our species also developed under shifting African climates and inherited no dependence on perfect stability. Human beings carried behavioral flexibility, social learning, and the ability to move. Yet those qualities did not guarantee that every movement would succeed. Climate could favor expansion without intending it and reverse that opportunity without warning. It could increase competition by concentrating two populations around the same productive valleys, or reduce contact by separating them across empty country. It could weaken prey before it weakened people directly. A community might appear to lose against another human lineage when the deeper contest was with distance, timing, and the failure of resources to return. No climate record proves that abrupt change caused Neanderthal disappearance, and no single cold phase explains why Homo sapiens eventually remained. Some research suggests that broad climate patterns influenced human ranges, while shorter abrupt events often produced regional rather than uniform effects. The importance of climate lies not in offering one final cause, but in changing the conditions under which every other cause operated. Bodies needed different amounts of energy. Networks became easier or harder to maintain. Familiar knowledge gained or lost value. Births, deaths, journeys, and encounters accumulated inside environments that could shift within the span of cultural memory. Europe was not a motionless arena where two humanities competed under fixed rules. The arena itself kept moving, and every generation inherited a different test. Vegetation did not merely decorate the landscapes of Ice Age Europe. It determined where animals could feed, where people could travel, and how far a community might need to move before finding food. During colder and drier periods, open grasslands and steppe environments could spread across large areas, supporting herds of grazing animals. During warmer or wetter phases, woodland could expand, breaking open country into smaller spaces and changing which animals were common. These shifts were not identical everywhere, and the same century could produce different conditions along a coast, inside a river valley, or across an upland plain. For people living without stored harvests or permanent infrastructure, even a local change in vegetation could alter daily survival. Large herbivores moved in response to grass, water, snow, and breeding cycles. Predators followed them, and human hunters had to understand those movements. A valley rich in prey during one season might become nearly empty in another. Some animals traveled long distances, while others changed their range gradually. Neanderthal communities could return to places where herds passed, but the reliability of those places depended upon environmental patterns that were never completely stable. When woodland thickened, animals adapted to open ground could decline or move elsewhere. Hunting visibility changed. Paths narrowed. Fuel might become easier to obtain, while long-distance travel became slower. When forests retreated, movement across open country became easier, but shelter and wood might be harder to find. Every landscape offered benefits and costs, and no community could preserve the same routine forever. These ecological changes affected more than food. They influenced how often neighboring groups met, how information traveled, and whether young adults could find partners beyond their immediate relatives. A broad grassland corridor might connect distant camps by allowing people and prey to move across it. The spread of dense woodland, deep snow, or dry country could break that corridor into isolated pockets. Once separation increased, the loss of several people became harder to repair. A community might still possess excellent hunters and skilled toolmakers, yet its future could narrow because the human network around it became thinner. This returns us to the beginning of Homo sapiens, whose expansion from Africa depended on following usable habitats rather than crossing empty geometric space. Our species moved through living corridors created by water, vegetation, animals, and other people. When those corridors shifted, an advance could slow or reverse. Early Homo sapiens entering Europe faced prey patterns shaped by climates they had not yet experienced over many generations. They could learn quickly, but rapid learning did not erase the cost of being wrong. Following a herd too far could separate people from shelter. Arriving after animals had moved could leave a camp without enough fat or meat. A route that seemed open in summer might become dangerous before winter ended. Neanderthals faced the same risks, but local familiarity may have helped them recognize subtle signs of seasonal change. Tracks, plant growth, snow conditions, and the timing of animal movement could carry meanings learned through repeated use of the same region. Yet inherited knowledge was not permanent protection. When climate reorganized an ecosystem beyond earlier experience, old expectations could fail. A hunting place remembered for generations might lose its value. Communities could move, adapt, or decline according to whether new patterns were discovered in time. The eventual spread of Homo sapiens, therefore, cannot be explained by saying that one population followed animals while another remained still. Both moved, both adjusted. Both depended on prey and plants whose ranges changed independently of human plans. The difference may have emerged from how widely each population was connected, how quickly losses could be replaced, and how many alternative territories remained accessible when one region failed. Forest and steppe were not passive backgrounds to human competition. They shaped where contact became likely, where isolation deepened, and where one lineage could appear to advance while another quietly withdrew. Human movement across Pleistocene Europe depended on opportunities that did not remain open forever. A route could become usable when rainfall returned. Rivers carried water, grasslands expanded, and herds moved into country that had previously been too dry or cold. The same route could later narrow when vegetation changed, snow lasted longer, or resources became scattered beyond the distance a community could safely travel. These openings were not gates in the modern sense. No boundary suddenly lifted, and no population received a signal that conditions were favourable. A climatic window was simply a period during which several needs aligned well enough for people to move, remain connected, and raise another generation. When that alignment ended, a population far from its wider network could remain on the wrong side of a closing landscape. Homo sapiens had crossed such windows before reaching Europe. Movements from Africa into Arabia and Western Asia occurred under changing conditions, and not every expansion continued. Some groups reached new regions, then became isolated as aridity returned or habitats shifted. Europe added another difficulty. The continent contained mountains, rivers, forests, plains, and northern cold arranged in ways that could guide movement into narrow corridors. Southeastern routes might become productive while western regions remained difficult. Central grasslands might support travel during one phase and become fragmented by woodland or severe conditions during another. A successful arrival in one region therefore did not mean the whole continent had become accessible. It meant that one sequence of places had briefly become connected. Neanderthals also depended on these openings. Their long history in Western Eurasia did not allow them to ignore climate. Populations expanded when habitats became suitable and withdrew when they did not. Archaeological sites often record occupation separated by gaps, suggesting repeated use rather than permanent residence. A cave could be visited during favourable intervals and abandoned between them. A region could contain Neanderthals for generations, lose them, and later receive other communities of the same lineage. Their advantage was not the ability to remain everywhere. It was accumulated knowledge that made retreat and return possible in landscapes already known through earlier experience. For Homo sapiens arriving from the south and east, a closing window could interrupt more than travel. It could interrupt the flow of people, partners, materials, and information from communities behind them. A small population might survive locally, but without renewal its future became fragile. The next winter need not be catastrophic. Several ordinary losses, combined with fewer arrivals, could slowly reduce the number of families able to remain connected. In this way, climate could influence which lineage continued without directly killing one population or choosing another. It changed the width of the human network. This returns us to the beginning of our species, because expansion was always ecological and social. People did not move as isolated bodies following temperature lines on a map. They carried children, tools, memories, obligations, and relationships. A corridor was useful only if it supported that system. Food had to be found repeatedly, not once. Travelers had to know where the next shelter lay. Distant groups had to remain close enough for contact to continue. When those conditions lasted, an arrival could become a population. When they ended too soon, a population might leave only a brief archaeological signal. No single climatic window explains the spread of Homo sapiens or the disappearance of Neanderthals. Evidence from some regions shows stable local environments during the transition. The lesson is restrained. Europe repeatedly offered temporary combinations of habitat, movement, and connection. Earlier, Homo sapiens entered during some of them, yet often failed to build roots deep enough to survive their closure. Neanderthals endured many closures, but each contraction pressured communities already scattered. The continent did not simply wait for one humanity to win. It opened unevenly, closed without warning, and kept changing the distance between survival in one generation and continuity in the next. Across the enormous range associated with Neanderthals, human presence was probably sparse, uneven, and often temporary. A map covered with archaeological sites can create the impression of a continent densely occupied, but those sites accumulated over tens of thousands of years. Many were not used at the same time. One cave might preserve visits separated by centuries, while an open camp could represent only a brief stop beside water or prey. Between such places stretched forests, plains, mountains, and cold uplands where no nearby community may have been visible. Neanderthals belonged to a widespread human lineage, yet any individual probably knew only a small portion of that vast world. Daily life was organized at the scale of companions who could travel, gather food, tend children, maintain fire, and share difficult work. Ancient DNA from several locations supports the view that local groups were often small. At some sites, individuals were close biological relatives, suggesting communities in which family ties formed much of the immediate social world. Genetic evidence also indicates periods of low diversity and small effective population size across the wider lineage. These findings should be interpreted cautiously. Effective population size is not a direct count of every living Neanderthal, and one cave cannot represent all of Europe. A small residential group could still belong to a larger network through visits, partnerships, movement, and exchange. Recent genetic work from northwestern Europe has strengthened this warning by revealing substantial connections among late Neanderthals across neighbouring regions. Thin occupation did not always mean complete isolation. It could mean a loose web whose strands were long, irregular, and vulnerable to being broken. Such a population could occupy an immense territory without filling it. Groups might cluster where water, shelter, stone, fuel, and animals came together, leaving less productive areas rarely used. Climate then shifted these centres. When grasslands expanded, prey and people could spread along open corridors. When forests, dryness, or severe cold divided habitats, the distance between communities could grow. A journey that once linked relatives might become too costly, and a local loss could no longer be repaired by newcomers. This returns the story to the origins of Homo sapiens. Our own lineage developed within structured African populations that were sometimes separated and sometimes reconnected. Human continuity did not depend on one camp becoming large enough to survive alone. It depended on movement between communities, allowing partners, knowledge, and ancestry to cross the spaces between them. The same basic need applied to Neanderthals. Local familiarity helped them use European landscapes, but familiarity could not create people where neighbouring groups had vanished. A community could know every reliable shelter in its valley and still face a demographic future narrowed by distance. Sparse settlement also changes what competition with arriving Homo sapiens may have looked like. There was probably no continuous Neanderthal front waiting across Europe. Newcomers might enter broad areas without seeing another human for long periods. Yet absence from sight did not mean resources were unused. The same herd, stone source, or winter refuge could support different groups at different times. Competition could occur indirectly as one population reduced opportunities available to another, even when they rarely met. In other places, contact may have brought exchange, interbreeding, or absorption. The pattern would have varied because human density itself varied. Neanderthals endured for so long not because they formed a crowded continental population, but because scattered communities repeatedly maintained enough connection to continue. That system was resilient across many environmental changes, yet it contained a quiet weakness. When distances widened, births fell, or several communities disappeared near one another, the remaining groups had fewer paths through which recovery could arrive. Europe could still appear inhabited while the human network beneath that appearance was becoming thinner. Its reach across space could conceal a declining capacity to replace people, renew relationships, and keep distant local histories connected through another uncertain generation of survival. A small community can be held together by relationships, that extend far beyond the people visible around one fire. At Chajskaya Cave in the Altai Mountains, ancient DNA recovered from several Neanderthal individuals revealed close biological ties, including a father and his daughter, along with other relatives who may have lived within the same broad period. The finding offered a rare glimpse of family life, but it did not produce a complete portrait of Neanderthal society. A cave gathers remains unevenly. Some people may have visited briefly, others may have died elsewhere, and those whose DNA survived represent only a narrow sample from one place near the eastern edge of the known Neanderthal range. Even so, the relationships matter because they show that at least one local community contained recognizable family connections, rather than a random collection of unrelated individuals. Genetic comparisons also suggested that women may have moved between neighboring groups more often than men in this population. Such movement could have connected small communities, brought new partners, and carried knowledge across distance. Yet this pattern should not be assumed for every Neanderthal group. The researchers themselves warned that the Altai population may have been shaped by its isolated geography, while communities farther west could have followed different arrangements. Kinship is not only a biological fact. Human groups are also formed through care, partnership, adoption, friendship, obligation, and shared work, most of which leave no clear genetic signature. DNA can identify close relatives, but it cannot tell us who taught a child to shape stone, who shared food with an injured adult, or who was regarded as family by the people themselves. The evidence therefore reveals a framework of connection while leaving the lived meaning of those connections uncertain. Distance placed pressure on that framework. If neighboring communities were separated by mountains, cold grasslands, forests, or empty territory, meetings required time and energy. A person moving to another group did more than change residence. That journey could renew genetic diversity, transfer local knowledge, and keep separate camps within a wider human network. When routes remained open, small groups did not need to survive as isolated islands. When climate or population decline made travel harder, families could become separated from the relationships that helped them recover after loss. Archaeological similarities between distant sites may hint at movement or shared traditions, but objects cannot identify the relationships that carried them. A tool form could travel through migration, exchange, imitation, or separate responses to similar needs, leaving several possible histories beneath one pattern. This returns the story to the origins of Homo sapiens, whose earlier African history also involved populations repeatedly dividing and reconnecting. Human survival was never secured by the household alone. It depended on wider ties through which partners, information, materials, and assistance could move. Neanderthals appear to have shared this basic dependence, though the scale and form of their networks varied. Their long occupation of Eurasia suggests that these links often worked well enough to preserve communities through difficult conditions. Yet small numbers meant that every broken connection carried weight. If one neighbouring group disappeared, the loss was not limited to its members. It also removed possible partners, remembered roots, exchanged tools, and a place of refuge. Earlier Homo sapiens entering Europe faced a similar problem, but their relationships may initially have stretched back toward populations outside the continent. If those connections weakened, newcomers could become stranded among unfamiliar landscapes. Neanderthals, meanwhile, could possess local family networks built over generations, though those networks were never guaranteed to remain intact. The image is therefore not of two armies, but of scattered circles of relatives and companions separated by uncertain distances. Their future depended on whether those circles continued to overlap. A continent could contain many capable people and still become demographically fragile when the paths between them grew too long, too dangerous, or too empty for human relationships to cross. A human population can survive for a very long time without becoming large, dense, or secure. Neanderthals demonstrate this distinction. Across Western Eurasia, their communities endured repeated climatic reversals, local disappearances, and movements into regions that later became unsuitable. Their persistence shows that small groups could preserve enough knowledge, cooperation, and contact to continue through many generations. Yet survival across a broad span of time did not mean steady expansion. Archaeological sites are unevenly distributed, occupations are often separated by gaps, and genetic evidence points to populations whose size and connectivity changed from place to place. Neanderthals could be deeply adapted to local conditions while remaining vulnerable at the wider demographic level. A community that knew its valley well might survive a difficult winter, but it could not replace distant neighbours who had vanished. If several nearby groups disappeared, the remaining people lost more than potential partners. They lost routes of exchange, alternative refuges, shared information, and sources of renewed population. Local competence could therefore coexist with regional fragility. This helps explain why a lineage may endure for thousands of generations, yet still approach a threshold from which recovery becomes difficult. The decline need not be smooth. Populations could contract during harsh periods and expand again when habitats reopened. Some regions may have remained well connected even late in Neanderthal history. Recent genetic work from northwestern Europe suggests that certain communities maintained broader relationships and substantial diversity, warning against the older picture of all late Neanderthals as isolated groups weakened by constant inbreeding. Other evidence from the Altai region reveals much smaller local communities and close relatives. Both patterns can be true because Neanderthal life was not organized identically across an entire continent. Connectivity could strengthen in one region while failing in another. A population network may resemble a fabric whose threads break and reconnect unevenly. For a long time, enough threads remained to preserve the whole. The danger appeared when losses occurred faster than new connections could form. This returns the story to the origins and movements of Homo sapiens. Early members of our lineage also entered Europe in small populations, and some disappeared despite possessing capable bodies, tools, and social intelligence. They had not yet created a network strong enough to repair every local loss. Neanderthals often retained the advantage of established roots and inherited familiarity, but an advantage based on continuity works only while continuity itself survives. If climate repeatedly separated habitats, if prey shifted beyond familiar ranges, or if neighbouring communities declined, the accumulated knowledge of one group could no longer circulate widely enough. People might continue living successfully in several valleys while the larger population became thinner around them. From inside any single camp, no final crisis would necessarily be visible. Children could still learn, adults could still hunt, and fires could still be renewed. The weakness would exist in the growing distance between communities and in the declining number of paths through which recovery could arrive. Survival without expansion was therefore both an achievement and a risk. Neanderthals had endured because their flexible local lives repeatedly matched changing environments. The same regional specialization could leave communities dependent on networks that were difficult to rebuild once broken. Homo sapiens did not need to eliminate every Neanderthal group directly. A population receiving more frequent arrivals could gradually occupy spaces left empty after local contractions, while established groups remained elsewhere. Over many generations, the balance of occupied land, available partners, and connected knowledge could shift without a single decisive encounter. The long endurance of Neanderthals should not be mistaken for inevitable permanence, just as their eventual disappearance should not be mistaken for proof of inferiority. No individual decision could reveal or reverse that continental change by itself. It reveals a quieter evolutionary truth. Persistence can conceal fragility, and a human world may continue functioning locally even while its wider capacity to renew itself is slowly becoming smaller. The pattern changed not because one extraordinary band of Homo sapiens entered Europe and defeated every Neanderthal group it encountered. The evidence points instead to repeated movements, overlapping arrivals, and populations whose descendants followed different paths. Some early modern humans reached Central and Northern Europe while Neanderthals were still present. Their ability to live in cold environments shows that our species was not restricted to mild southern corridors. Yet several of these early populations appear to have been small and left little ancestry in later Europeans. Their arrival was real, but their demographic future was limited. Other groups followed, sometimes carrying related traditions, sometimes belonging to different branches of the expanding human population. Europe was not taken in one wave. It was entered again and again until human presence became harder to erase. Repeated arrival changes the arithmetic of survival. A small community that loses several adults may decline if nobody replaces them. The same community can recover when new people continue to enter from connected regions. New arrivals bring more than bodies. They can bring partners, children, information, tools, and knowledge gathered along routes extending beyond one local landscape. Their presence widens the number of relationships through which a damaged group can rebuild. Even when individual camps remain small, the population behind them may no longer be isolated. This does not require every newcomer to cooperate peacefully or every movement to be planned. It requires only that movement continues often enough for local failures to stop becoming permanent. Neanderthal communities had survived earlier climatic contractions through their own mobility and regional networks. Their long endurance proves that they were capable of renewal. The imbalance may have emerged when the flow supporting Homo sapiens became more frequent or geographically wider than the connections supporting Neanderthals. A Neanderthal group that disappeared from one valley might once have been replaced by relatives returning from another region. If neighboring populations were also shrinking, that return became less likely. Homo sapiens could then occupy the same empty space, not because they had won a battle there, but because more people continued arriving behind them. Over generations, vacant shelters, hunting grounds, and routes would increasingly be used by one population rather than the other. The beginning of this change remains difficult to identify, because archaeology preserves scattered moments rather than a continuous migration record. A technology can spread without a large movement of people, and people can move without carrying one recognizable toolkit. Bones and genomes reveal that early Homo sapiens in Europe were not one uniform founding population. Some belonged to branches that later faded. Others contributed to populations farther east or to later Europeans only indirectly. The final outcome was assembled from these uneven histories. What mattered was not one perfect group, but the cumulative effect of movement repeated across time. This interpretation also explains why the title must remain a question, rather than a literal account of conquest. Neanderthals may have outlasted many early arrivals because those newcomers were few, disconnected, or caught behind closing ecological corridors. Later, Homo sapiens were still vulnerable to cold, hunger, injury, and local extinction. What changed may have been the scale of the population process surrounding them. Each camp no longer represented a single attempt whose disappearance ended the expansion. It became one point within a larger and continuing flow. If one group failed, another could appear elsewhere or follow later. If knowledge was lost locally, similar knowledge could return through contact. No individual traveller could see this continental pattern, and no Neanderthal community could confront it as one enemy. It accumulated quietly through births, journeys, partnerships, and repeated settlement. Europe did not suddenly receive a superior humanity. It began receiving enough connected human movement that temporary arrival could slowly become demographic permanence. The decisive difference may have been repetition itself, transforming isolated footholds into a population able to survive losses that once ended earlier expansions. A camp could survive only through the people gathered there, but a population survived through relationships extending beyond any single fire. For Homo sapiens entering Europe, wider networks may have helped transform temporary presence into continuity. Archaeology cannot draw those networks directly. It can only reveal clues. Stone carried far from its source, ornaments made from distant materials, and related techniques appearing across separate sites. None of these signs proves that every group traveled widely or exchanged goods through an organized system. Materials could move through repeated short journeys, and similar ideas could arise independently. Taken together, however, they suggest that some early modern humans belonged to social worlds larger than the small communities in which daily life occurred. A wider network changed what happened when one camp faced difficulty. If prey failed locally, information from another region could point toward a different route or season. If several adults died, contact with neighboring communities could bring partners and restore numbers. If a tool-making method disappeared after the death of a skilled person, visitors could return comparable knowledge. A group did not need to store large reserves if it remained connected to people beyond the immediate landscape. Relationships became a form of protection. The network could fail when climate-separated habitats or too many communities disappeared along the same route. Neanderthals also maintained connections beyond individual camps. Stone movement, genetic evidence, and similarities between sites show that they were not universally isolated. Some late communities in northwestern Europe appear to have participated in regional connectivity. The important comparison is therefore not between social Homo sapiens and solitary Neanderthals. Both lineages depended on wider relationships. The possible difference lay in scale, density, renewal, and the direction from which new people continued to arrive. A Neanderthal network might connect several neighboring communities yet remain vulnerable if the surrounding population was contracting. A Homo sapiens camp could be equally small but linked through groups extending eastward and southward toward larger streams of movement. Even weak connections repeated across generations could produce a different demographic result. This possibility reaches back to the African origins of Homo sapiens. Our species emerged within populations divided across a vast continent, yet repeatedly reconnected. Such a history may have preserved diversity in bodies, technologies, diets, and social practices without requiring one uniform culture. When groups expanded into Eurasia, they carried not merely individual intelligence but habits of maintaining relationships across distance. We cannot know whether these habits were always broader than those of Neanderthals, and the evidence does not support a permanent difference everywhere. Yet once repeated migrations entered Europe, networks could accumulate. Later travelers might follow tested routes, recognize materials moved from distant places, or join communities containing relatives from another region. Information did not need to cross the continent in one journey. It could move slowly from group to group, surviving local interruptions. Wider connections also influenced identity without creating a single united people. Groups could speak differently, use distinct tools, avoid one another, compete, or exchange only occasionally. Network strength did not require harmony. It required enough movement for people and knowledge to cross spaces that would otherwise become empty. This helps explain how Homo sapiens could remain vulnerable as individuals while becoming harder to remove as a population. A harsh winter could still destroy a camp. An isolated lineage could still disappear, but another connected group might survive nearby, return later, or absorb the remaining people. Neanderthal communities had renewed themselves in similar ways for an immense time, yet their wider population may increasingly have had fewer places from which renewal could come. What changed was not the human need for connection. It was the growing reach and persistence of the connection supporting one population. Europe was not secured by a brilliant mind standing alone, but by many relationships carrying food, partners, memory, and possibility across distances. No single community could safely endure by itself. No single invention can explain why Homo sapiens eventually became established across Europe, while Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population. Archaeologists have identified changes in stone tools, hunting equipment, ornaments, clothing technology, and the use of bone, antler, wood, and plant fibers during the long transition. Some early Homo sapiens groups may have used mechanically propelled projectiles, while other evidence suggests close-range weapons continued alongside them. Personal ornaments and pigments may have carried social meanings, helping people recognize affiliations or maintain relationships beyond immediate camps. More varied tools may have increased the range of tasks people could perform. Yet, none of these practices appears everywhere at the same time, and no artifact can be treated as the device that won a continent. Technologies spread unevenly, were lost, modified, or independently developed, and some behaviors once considered unique to Homo sapiens are also associated with Neanderthals in specific places. The important question is therefore not whether newcomers possessed one miraculous object, but whether several modest advantages worked together within a larger population system. A lighter projectile could reduce the danger of approaching prey, but it still required suitable materials, practice, accurate judgment, and animals within reach. Sewn or carefully fitted clothing could help in cold conditions, but clothing had to be made, repaired, and carried. Ornaments could strengthen social recognition, but they could not feed a child during winter. A broad diet might reduce dependence on one resource, yet gathering many foods required knowledge of seasons and local terrain. Each ability addressed only one human problem at once. Its value depended on people sharing it, materials supporting it, and networks preserving it after individual deaths. This returns the story to the African origins of Homo sapiens. Our lineage emerged through populations that lived in varied environments, and repeatedly exchanged genes, skills, and people across distance. Such a background may have encouraged flexibility, but it did not create a fixed package carried unchanged into Europe. The groups that arrived differed from one another, and several early expansions still disappeared. What eventually mattered may have been the accumulation of behaviors within populations receiving continued movement from Western Asia. New people could introduce alternative methods, restore lost skills, and enlarge the number of individuals able to experiment. Innovation then became less dependent on one small community preserving every technique by itself. One community could lose a useful practice, while another preserved it, and continuing contact allowed the practice to return instead of disappearing permanently after a single local interruption or death. Neanderthals also innovated, used complex materials, and adjusted tools to local needs. Their disappearance cannot be explained by saying that they lacked culture. The possible imbalance arose when one population had more opportunities for useful practices to circulate, combine, and survive demographic loss. Even then, technology was only one influence among climate. Population size, mobility, competition, and interbreeding. A weapon may improve one hunt without changing the future of a lineage. A wider network may change that future by allowing many small improvements to reach more people. Over generations, better clothing, safer hunting, exchanged information, flexible food use, and repeated migration could reinforce one another. None needed to be overwhelming alone. Together they could make local failure less final. Europe was not transformed by a sudden flash of superior intelligence. It was changed through cumulative human activity, repeated often enough that knowledge could remain connected to people who continued arriving. Neanderthals had maintained their own successful systems for an immense time, but systems depend upon the number and distribution of communities able to renew them. Once that balance shifted, even capable local traditions might not spread far enough to repair every loss. The turning point was therefore probably not an invention that can be held in one hand. It was a changing relationship among tools, bodies, environments, and population networks, in which many small differences became historically powerful only because they traveled together. When Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occupied Europe during the long transition, they did not stand along a single border waiting to confront one another. Their presence was distributed unevenly across valleys, caves, river corridors, uplands, and plains that changed in usefulness as climate and prey shifted. One region might contain late Neanderthal communities while another already held early Homo sapiens. Elsewhere, the archaeological sequence may show one population leaving before the other appeared. Even when dates overlap across a broad area, the people involved may have been separated by hundreds of kilometers or by several generations. Chronological coexistence, therefore, does not automatically prove direct contact. It means that two human lineages inhabited parts of the same continent within the same general span of time. Europe, during these millennia, was more like a moving mosaic than a divided battlefield. Each patch had its own history. In some caves, different tool traditions appear in successive layers, but assigning every tradition to one kind of human remains difficult unless bones or genetic material provide stronger identification. At Grotte Mandrine in southern France, evidence has been interpreted as alternating occupations by Neanderthals and an early Homo sapiens group. Yet even there, the sequence does not show two communities sharing the shelter at once or fighting for it. It shows that the same useful place could pass between populations as movements, absences, and returns unfolded. In the Italian peninsula, improved dating at several sites suggests that Neanderthals may have disappeared locally before Homo sapiens arrived, reminding us that replacement did not follow one continental timetable. This uneven pattern returns us to the beginnings of Homo sapiens expansion. Earlier travelers entered Europe through corridors opened by ecology, then spread into regions where human occupation was thin and changing. They may have moved through empty spaces created by Neanderthal contraction, approached places still used by Neanderthal groups, or followed routes whose former occupants had already withdrawn. Neanderthals likewise moved rather than defending permanent territories. Their camps were used seasonally, abandoned when conditions changed, and sometimes revisited after long gaps. Two populations could therefore use the same landscape without meeting frequently, while still affecting one another through pressure on animals, stone sources, shelters, and travel routes. When encounters did occur, No single outcome should be assumed. People might avoid strangers, observe them from a distance, exchange objects or knowledge, compete, form partnerships, or use violence. Human behavior allows all these possibilities, but archaeology rarely identifies which one occurred in a particular valley. A damaged bone does not name the attacker. A new tool form does not prove peaceful teaching. An empty camp does not reveal whether its occupants died, departed, or joined another community. The safest account remains one of variable relationships shaped by local circumstances. Genetic evidence confirms that at least some meetings became intimate enough for children to inherit ancestry from both lineages. That fact rules out a story of complete separation, but it does not tell us how common contact was everywhere. Some early Homo sapiens carried recent Neanderthal ancestry, while recent research on late Neanderthals in northwestern Europe has not found equally clear evidence of recent Homo sapiens ancestry within those sampled individuals. The record may reflect unequal movement, limited sampling, or differences between regions. What it cannot support is a simple image of one advancing army pushing another westward. The continental result emerged through many local histories that did not all resemble one another. Homo sapiens became more widespread while Neanderthal presence contracted, yet their boundaries remained porous, temporary, and often invisible. No witness could see the whole transformation, because the wider pattern existed only through countless journeys, births, disappearances, and encounters scattered beyond any single human memory. To understand what defeat meant, we must first abandon the imagined front line and follow a landscape where contact could be close in one place, absent in another, and separated by silence almost everywhere between. Direct encounters between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were probably uncommon compared with the long periods when each community moved through Europe without seeing the other. Human populations were sparse, camps were temporary, and useful places could be separated by wide stretches of land. Two groups might follow the same herd weeks apart, collect stone from the same source in different seasons, or return to one shelter after its previous occupants had gone. They could influence each other without standing face to face. If one community hunted animals before another arrived, less food remained. If people occupied a protected cave during winter, later travelers had to continue searching. Competition could therefore occur through timing and geography rather than violence. Avoidance was another possible response. Strangers may have represented uncertainty, especially when food was scarce and neither group knew the intentions of the other. Smoke in the distance, fresh footprints, abandoned tools, or recently butchered animals could reveal another human presence before any meeting occurred. A community might change direction, wait, or leave a familiar place rather than risk contact. Archaeology cannot recover such decisions. A campsite abandoned after a short occupation looks much the same whether people feared strangers, followed prey, lost a member, or simply completed their planned journey. Silence in the record cannot be translated confidently into hostility. Exchange is equally difficult to identify. A tool-making technique appearing in a new region may have traveled through observation or teaching, but it may also have developed independently, because people faced similar materials and tasks. Objects found far from their sources may have passed between groups, moved through several short journeys, or been carried by one widely traveling community. Some technologies associated with the transition between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens occupations have generated long debate because the human makers are not always securely identified. The evidence permits cultural contact in some places, but rarely demonstrates exactly who taught whom. This uncertainty returns us to the African beginnings of Homo sapiens, where populations exchanged genes and knowledge across changing networks long before entering Europe. Our lineage already depended on learning from people beyond one household. Neanderthals also transmitted complex skills and maintained regional relationships. When the two lineages approached one another, neither encountered a mind without culture. They encountered another human tradition shaped by different histories, materials, roots, and memories. Similarity may have made exchange possible, while unfamiliarity could still encourage distance or conflict. The same pair of populations might cooperate during one encounter and compete during another, just as relationships among communities of our own species have never followed a single rule. Violence cannot be excluded. Human skeletons sometimes preserve injuries, and groups competing for scarce resources may have fought. Yet no collection of European remains demonstrates a continuous war in which Neanderthals repeatedly drove every Homo sapiens arrival away. Injuries can result from accidents, hunting, conflict within a group, or encounters with outsiders. Weapons used on animals could also be used against people, but possibility is not proof. The title's language of defeat must therefore remain a metaphor for demographic outcomes rather than a documented military history. Contact probably ranged from absence to avoidance, from indirect competition to exchange, and from reproduction to occasional violence. Each outcome would have depended on local numbers, food, season, familiarity, and the relationships surrounding the people involved. Over thousands of years, small encounters could influence movement and ancestry without becoming one decisive event. Europe changed through many meetings that left no witnesses, and through many near meetings that left no trace at all. A single valley could hold all of these possibilities across different generations, turning the same shelter into a refuge, a boundary, a shared meeting place, or an empty memory. The most honest reconstruction accepts that another human presence could be threatening, useful, intimate, or simply distant, and that the ground rarely tells us which meaning it carried on any particular day. Ancient DNA preserves one of the clearest signs that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did more than pass through the same landscapes. In the genomes of many people living outside Africa today, small portions of ancestry came from Neanderthals. This inheritance shows that members of the two lineages had children whose descendants continued into later populations. It does not describe the circumstances of those encounters, and it cannot tell us whether relationships began through cooperation, conflict, exchange, capture, or bonds that fit none of our modern categories. Genes record biological connection, not the human meaning surrounding it. Some early Homo sapiens found in Europe carried unusually long segments of Neanderthal DNA. Long inherited segments are broken into smaller pieces through reproduction across generations, so their size can indicate that a Neanderthal ancestor lived relatively recently in a person's family history. An individual from Pestra Q. Oase in Romania had such recent ancestry, while several early people from Bacho Kiro cave in Bulgaria also had Neanderthal ancestors only a small number of generations earlier. These discoveries show that interbreeding was not limited to one remote event before Homo sapiens spread across Europe. Meetings occurred again while modern human populations were entering regions occupied by Neanderthals. Yet those early individuals did not all become ancestors of later Europeans. The population represented at Oase appears to have contributed little detectable ancestry to subsequent people in Europe, and some early Bacho Kiro individuals were more closely related to later populations in Asia than to later Europeans. A person could therefore carry both human lineages within one body while belonging to a population that later disappeared. Interbreeding did not guarantee demographic success. It could connect communities temporarily, absorb individuals into another group, or produce descendants whose ancestry continued somewhere else. DNA also warns against imagining a clean replacement in which every Neanderthal vanished without entering the surviving population. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population, but portions of their ancestry remained within Homo sapiens. The amount preserved today is not a direct measure of how often people met, because natural selection, population growth, migration, and chance altered which inherited segments survived. Some Neanderthal variants may have been harmful in new genetic backgrounds and became less common. Others persisted, while many were lost through ordinary inheritance. The present genome is therefore the filtered remainder of ancient contact, not a complete record of every mixed family. This returns us to the origins of Homo sapiens and the repeated movements beyond Africa. The people entering Europe were not a single pure lineage confronting another sealed humanity. Their ancestors had already experienced population, separation, reunion, and exchange. Neanderthals also had their own complex population history across Eurasia. When these histories met, biological boundaries proved permeable. The result was not immediate unity. Communities could mix in one region and remain apart in another. Genetic studies of sampled late Neanderthals have not revealed equally clear recent Homo sapiens ancestry in every case, but the sample is too limited to prove that movement of genes occurred only in one direction. Bones containing recoverable DNA are rare, and many populations remain genetically unknown. The strongest conclusion is restrained but profound. At least some newcomers were not simply driven away, and at least some Neanderthals were not simply eliminated. People met closely enough to create families, yet several mixed populations still failed to endure as recognizable lines. Their existence complicates the language of victory. If one population slowly became more numerous while absorbing members of another, replacement and continuity could happen together. Descendants carried that contact forward without preserving the full story. Europe's transition was therefore not the disappearance of every Neanderthal trace beneath an advancing Homo sapiens world. It was a demographic transformation in which boundaries between populations weakened, even as one population name vanished, leaving ancestry as the quiet evidence that the encounter was more intimate, uneven, and human than conquest alone can explain. Neanderthals did not disappear from Europe in one night, one century, or one synchronized retreat. The archaeological record shows a regional process whose timing differed from place to place, because human populations were scattered, and because the surviving evidence itself remains extremely uneven. In some areas, Neanderthal occupation ended before clear signs of Homo sapiens appeared. In others, the two populations overlapped within the uncertainty of available dates. Farther north, modern humans had already entered cold environments while Neanderthals still lived in southwestern regions. These differences make it misleading to imagine a single wave moving steadily from east to west, pushing one humanity before another. Europe changed through local endings, new arrivals, abandoned territories, and repeated movements that did not follow one continental schedule. Dating these events is difficult because the material used for radiocarbon analysis can be contaminated by younger carbon, making ancient remains appear more recent than they are. Improved preparation methods have revised several supposed examples of extremely late Neanderthal survival. Stone tools add another uncertainty. A tool tradition may be associated with Neanderthals at many sites, but without human remains or genetic evidence, the identity of its makers cannot always be assumed. The last dated artifact in a region is also not necessarily the object made by the last person who lived there. Small communities can vanish without leaving remains from their final generations. For this reason, scientists speak more confidently about ranges and regional patterns than about an exact last day. The uneven retreat may have reflected differences in habitat, population density, and access to neighboring communities. A productive valley could support Neanderthals after nearby areas became empty. A southern refuge might remain usable while colder or drier conditions weakened populations elsewhere. Coastal resources, sheltered terrain, or reliable prey could extend occupation locally, although no refuge offered permanent safety. When a community disappeared from one region, Neanderthals in another region did not necessarily know that anything larger was happening. Their world was measured through roots, relatives, seasons, and places within reach, not through the continental pattern visible to archaeology today. This returns the story to the origins of Homo sapiens expansion. Newcomers also arrived unevenly. Some early groups reached Central and Northern Europe without becoming the ancestors of later populations. Others followed through different corridors and at different times. A region left vacant by Neanderthals could be entered by Homo sapiens without direct confrontation. Elsewhere, both populations may have occupied neighboring landscapes, met or alternated at the same shelter. The wider replacement was assembled from these contrasting local histories. It cannot be reduced to one battle, one climate event, or one migration. Regional disappearance also complicates the word extinction. Neanderthals ceased to exist as a distinct population, yet some individuals may have joined Homo sapiens communities, and portions of Neanderthal ancestry continued in later people. In one valley, the ending may have involved relocation. In another, declining births or lost connections. Elsewhere, absorption, competition, environmental stress, or several pressures together may have changed. Which population remained? The surviving evidence rarely identifies the final combination. What it reveals is a retreat occurring at different speeds, with no clear boundary where all Neanderthal life ended and all Homo sapiens life began. The silence between dated occupations may represent decades, centuries, or missing deposits, so absence must remain a measured conclusion rather than a dramatic scene. What looks from a distance like withdrawal may have been, for the people living through it, only another journey toward food, kin, shelter, or safer ground. By the time the continental transformation became complete, it had already been unfolding through countless local changes beyond the memory of any individual. Europe did not pass from one humanity to another in a single historical moment. It became a mosaic in which Neanderthal presence grew thinner, Homo sapiens presence became more continuous, and many places changed occupants without preserving the human circumstances of that change. No single pressure is sufficient to explain why Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population. Climate changed repeatedly, but Neanderthals had survived severe shifts long before the final transition. Homo sapiens entered Europe, yet their presence did not produce an immediate or uniform Neanderthal retreat. Small population size may have increased vulnerability, but not every lake community was equally isolated or genetically burdened. Interbreeding preserved Neanderthal ancestry, although absorption alone cannot be measured as the complete cause of disappearance. Competition for prey, shelter, stone, and habitable corridors may also have mattered, but archaeology does not reveal one continuous struggle across the continent. The most careful explanation, therefore, begins with interaction among pressures rather than a search for one decisive blow. Climate could reduce available habitat without directly eliminating every community. When grasslands contracted, prey might shift, routes might close, and neighbouring groups might become harder to reach. A population already living at low density would then have fewer nearby communities from which partners, information, or replacement members could arrive. If Homo sapiens continued moving into the same broad regions, vacant places could be occupied before Neanderthal networks recovered. Competition would then operate through access and renewal, not necessarily through direct confrontation. A shelter used by newcomers was no longer available at that moment to others. An animal population hunted by one group could support fewer people nearby. Even modest differences, repeated across generations, could alter which population remained more connected. Disease has also been proposed as a possible influence when populations with different histories met, but direct evidence is limited, and no epidemic can be identified as the event that ended Neanderthal life. New pathogens might have moved in either direction, while repeated contact and interbreeding could also have transferred immune variants. The possibility deserves caution rather than dramatic certainty. Similar restraint is needed with volcanic eruptions and abrupt cold events. These events changed regional environments and may have intensified existing stress, yet Neanderthal disappearance did not occur everywhere at the same moment. A catastrophe that harmed one area cannot automatically explain another region with a different chronology. Demography connects these pressures because it determines how much loss a population can absorb. A large and well-connected population may survive several local failures. A smaller network can be damaged by the same events even when most individuals are capable and well adapted. If births decline, adults die, routes close, and neighbouring communities vanish within overlapping generations, recovery becomes less likely. Continued Homo sapiens migration could deepen the imbalance without requiring biological superiority. New arrivals supplied people to one population, while the other increasingly depended on a shrinking regional reserve. Interbreeding may then have blurred the boundary further. Some Neanderthal individuals or families could have entered Homo sapiens communities, preserving ancestry while reducing the number of communities identified as Neanderthal. Others may have remained separate, moved away, or disappeared locally. These outcomes could occur together in different places. This returns us to the beginning of Homo sapiens expansion, which succeeded not because every group survived, but because movement continued after many local lineages ended. The final transformation of Europe was probably produced by accumulation, climatic disruption, thin populations, shifting resources, competition, migration, contact, and absorption reinforcing one another unevenly. None of these forces needed to be overwhelming on its own. Their combined effect could slowly reduce the number of places where Neanderthal communities could recover after loss. From inside one camp, life might still appear familiar. Tools were made, food was shared, children learned, and routes were remembered. The larger danger existed beyond sight, in missing neighbours and occupied spaces. History changes this way, through pressures too small to look decisive until their consequences have accumulated beyond recovery across generations. Neanderthals were not erased by one cause. Their distinct population may have ended because several ordinary pressures became extraordinary when they converged upon a human network with less room left to renew itself. What changed was not one weapon, one mutation, one winter, or one meeting. The balance changed because several processes began to reinforce one another across a continent already divided into small human populations. Homo sapiens had entered Europe before, but earlier groups often remained isolated, disappeared, or contributed little ancestry to later people. During the later expansion, arrivals continued across wider regions and over longer periods. This did not make every camp secure. Some modern human populations still vanished, yet the larger movement behind them meant that one local failure no longer ended the entire attempt. New groups could occupy empty ground, reconnect survivors, and restore the flow of partners, skills, and information. Neanderthals still possessed strong bodies, practiced technologies, and knowledge shaped through long residence. Nothing suggests that these abilities suddenly stopped working. The problem was that local success had to be renewed within a population whose distribution was already thin. When neighbouring communities declined, the loss extended beyond their members. Routes became quieter, choices of partners narrowed, and remembered places disappeared from the living network. Climate could deepen that thinning by moving prey and breaking useful habitats into smaller regions. Homo sapiens faced the same environmental uncertainty, but repeated migration may have supplied their communities from a larger demographic source. This difference did not need to be enormous during any single generation. A few more arrivals, a few more connections, or a slightly greater chance of replacing local losses could accumulate until the landscape contained more communities of one population than the other. Technology may have strengthened this process without causing it alone. Clothing, hunting equipment, ornaments, food choices, and methods of working stone, bone, wood, or fibre could reduce particular risks. Their greater power came when knowledge travelled through networks able to preserve several solutions at once. A useful technique lost in one camp might survive elsewhere and return through contact. Innovation became less fragile when more people remained connected. Neanderthal communities also exchanged knowledge and materials, but a contracting population offered fewer places where a lost practice could be preserved. Interbreeding altered the boundary again. Some Neanderthals may have joined communities of Homo sapiens, while mixed descendants continued within populations increasingly described as modern human. In such cases, the number of distinct Neanderthal communities could decline, even while Neanderthal ancestry survived. Other groups may have remained separate, moved toward shrinking habitats, or disappeared after ordinary demographic losses. The evidence does not allow one outcome to represent every region. Recent genetic research also cautions against the idea that late Neanderthals were everywhere undergoing steady genetic collapse. At least some communities retained diversity and connections near the end of their history. Their disappearance therefore cannot be explained as the inevitable failure of a biologically ruined population. This returns us to the beginning of Homo sapiens, not as a species destined to conquer, but as a lineage repeatedly moving from a larger and deeply structured population history. What changed in Europe was the scale and persistence of that movement, combined with environmental disruption, local competition, social networks, technology, chance, and absorption. Together, these forces made Homo sapiens' presence increasingly renewable, while Neanderthal recovery became less certain. The title's claim of repeated defeat can now be understood only as an outcome seen from a great distance. Earlier arrivals entered and faded while Neanderthals remained. Later arrivals did not necessarily become stronger fighters. They became part of a population process that could continue after individual communities failed. Europe changed when arrival stopped being an isolated event and became a sustained pattern. No person living through the transition could have recognized the moment, because there may have been no moment at all. There was only a gradual shift in which one human network gained more paths toward recovery, while another lost them faster than they could be rebuilt. Across generations, that difference quietly transformed temporary survival into lasting demographic continuity across Europe. Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record as a recognizable population, but disappearance did not mean that every line connecting them to the future was broken. ancient DNA has shown that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had children together, and some of those children belonged to families whose descendants continued. Small inherited segments of Neanderthal ancestry remain in many living populations, especially among people whose ancestors moved through Eurasia. Later migrations also carried some of this ancestry into other regions. The pattern is uneven because populations mixed repeatedly, natural selection altered inherited variants, and chance determined which pieces passed from one generation to the next. No living person is partly Neanderthal in the simple sense suggested by an ancestry label. Each genome contains a scattered record of many ancestors, and the segments inherited from Neanderthals form only a small portion of that history. Different people carry different pieces. Across many individuals, researchers can identify a much broader collection than any one person possesses, showing how an extinct population can remain genetically distributed through another. This survival should not be confused with the continuation of Neanderthal communities themselves. A population is more than a set of genes. It includes people who recognize one another, raise children, share knowledge, move through familiar places, and maintain relationships across generations. Once those connected communities no longer existed as a distinct network, their population history had ended even though some ancestry continued inside expanding Homo sapiens groups. The transition, therefore, contained both loss and continuity. Languages, remembered roots, teaching practices, local identities, and countless forms of knowledge could disappear while fragments of biological inheritance survived silently. DNA can preserve evidence of descent, but it cannot recover the social world that gave that descent meaning. Some inherited Neanderthal variants were gradually reduced because they were disadvantageous in particular genetic or environmental contexts. Other variants remained, and a smaller number may have influenced adaptation in later populations. These effects are complex. A genetic variant does not belong to one simple trait, and its influence can change with other genes, age, environment, and lifestyle. It would be misleading to describe living people as carrying a Neanderthal gene for strength, sleep, immunity, skin, or any other single quality. Researchers study statistical associations and evolutionary histories, not fixed prehistoric instructions controlling modern lives. This returns us to the beginning of the encounter in Europe. Homo sapiens did not replace Neanderthals while remaining untouched by them. Some newcomers entered Neanderthal ancestry into their own family lines, and those lines travelled far beyond the landscapes where contact first occurred. The population that became more numerous carried traces of the population that ceased to exist separately. In that limited biological sense, replacement was incomplete, yet it would also be inaccurate to say that Neanderthals simply became modern humans, because most of their ancestry communities and distinct evolutionary history did not continue. Absorption may have contributed to their disappearance, but it cannot be treated as the only cause. Climate, demography, movement, competition, isolation, and chance still belong within the explanation. The genetic inheritance changes the emotional shape of the outcome without solving it. This inheritance also reminds us that extinction at the population level is not always a total biological erasure. An ancestral community may lose its separate continuity while leaving descendants inside the population that grows around, beside, or slowly after it. Neanderthals were not only neighbours who vanished from Europe. For many later people, they also became distant ancestors. Their presence survives not as a complete identity hidden inside us, but as scattered evidence that human boundaries were permeable before one lineage name disappeared. The history of Europe was therefore not a clean victory in which the defeated left nothing behind. It was a transformation in which one human network expanded, another dissolved, and fragments of their ancestry continued together, carried by descendants who could never remember the encounters that made their existence possible. Survival is often mistaken for proof of superiority, but evolution does not work as a moral judgment. A population that remains is not automatically wiser, stronger, or more deserving than one that disappears. It may simply have been larger, more connected, better placed within a changing environment, or luckier across a series of uncertain generations. Homo sapiens survived in Europe while Neanderthals ceased to exist as a distinct population, yet this outcome does not rank one humanity above another. Both lineages learned, cooperated, raised children, cared for injured companions, shaped tools, used fire, and adapted to landscapes that could change faster than any body could evolve. Their differences mattered, but they did not form a ladder with one human standing naturally above the other. The final result emerged from history, not destiny. Population size could amplify a small advantage. Repeated migration could repair local losses. Wider networks could keep knowledge alive after one camp disappeared. A favorable route could remain open long enough for families to settle, while another route could close and isolate equally capable people. Chance could alter which children survived, which communities met, and which inherited lines continued. These forces do not make the outcome random in every sense, but they show why survival cannot be reduced to individual merit. A person can be skilled and still live within a population too small to recover. A community can know its land deeply and still lose contact with the neighbors who once renewed it. This lesson reaches beyond Neanderthals. Human history is often told through winners because the surviving population leaves more descendants, more artifacts, and more later stories. The people who disappear are then described as if their ending revealed a weakness visible from the beginning. That view reverses cause and consequence. Neanderthals endured through immense environmental change before their population ended. Their long existence was not a failed preparation for Homo sapiens. It was a successful human history in its own right, lived without knowledge of the future label that later people would give them. The same is true of early Homo sapiens groups that entered Europe and left little lasting ancestry. Their lines may have ended, yet their lives were not incomplete. They moved, learned, formed relationships, and understood places whose names are gone. Evolution preserves descendants, not the value of the lives that came before them. This distinction matters because ideas of biological superiority have often been misused in the modern world. Ancient population replacement does not support claims that one living group is naturally destined to dominate another. All living humans belong to one closely related species, shaped by repeated migration and mixture. Differences among populations are recent, overlapping, and far smaller than the shared biological inheritance connecting us. Neanderthal ancestry itself crosses modern boundaries and does not divide humanity into higher and lower kinds. The educational value of this history lies in humility. Our presence today was not guaranteed. The ancestors of living people passed through bottlenecks, migrations, environmental reversals, and encounters whose outcomes could have been different. Their survival depended on cooperation as much as competition, on inherited knowledge as much as innovation, and on relationships as much as physical ability. To recognize this does not weaken the achievement of Homo sapiens. It places that achievement within the conditions that made it possible. We are the descendants of populations that continued, but we also carry traces of meetings, losses, and absorbed lineages that prevent any simple story of triumph. Europe did not become human when Neanderthals disappeared, because it was already human before our lasting arrival. What changed was which human network remained visible as a separate population. Remembering that difference allows the past to teach something quieter than victory. Survival is a responsibility to understand how fragile continuity can be, and how much every human future has always depended upon connections no individual could create alone across time and distance. The disappearance of Neanderthals is too often described as a failed branch reaching extinction, but that description says more about the habits of modern storytelling than about the people themselves. A lineage can vanish without its existence becoming a mistake. Neanderthals lived across Western Eurasia for an immense span of time, adapting to forests, grasslands, coasts, cold phases, warmer intervals, and the repeated loss of familiar habitats. They made tools, used fire, cared for children, moved through difficult terrain, and carried knowledge that allowed one generation to follow another. Their population eventually ceased to continue as a separate human network, yet nothing in that ending erases the success contained in all the generations that came before it. Homo sapiens remained, but our survival was never the simple opposite of their disappearance. Some of our ancestors entered Europe and vanished as distinct populations. Others mixed with Neanderthals. Still others arrived later through wider and more persistent movements. The population that survived was therefore not untouched, uniform, or destined to win. It was assembled through migration, loss, absorption, renewal, and chance. The human world that emerged carried traces of several earlier worlds, even when their names and memories were gone. This is where the title's language of defeat finally becomes too narrow. Neanderthals may have outlasted many early arrivals because they were already rooted in European landscapes, while newcomers were still learning how to remain. Later, the balance changed as Homo sapiens became connected through repeated movement, broader networks, and communities that could recover after local failure. Climate, resources, population size, technology, interbreeding, and ordinary demographic uncertainty all contributed. No final battle is required, and no single invention explains the outcome. What looks from a great distance like victory may have been countless local decisions made by people who never understood that a continental transformation was taking place. A family followed prey toward another valley. A child survived one winter and not another. A community lost contact with relatives beyond the mountains. Strangers met, avoided one another, exchanged knowledge, formed bonds, or remained unseen. One shelter was abandoned, another was occupied again. Across many generations, these small events changed which human network could continue renewing itself. The lesson is not that strength failed or intelligence triumphed. It is that survival depends on relationships extending beyond any single body. Knowledge must be shared before it disappears. Communities must remain connected before isolation becomes permanent. A population must have enough paths toward recovery when climate, illness, injury, hunger, or chance removes people from the future. Neanderthals possessed these paths for a very long time. Homo sapiens eventually developed more of them across Europe, but even our lineage remained vulnerable, and many of its early branches also ended. Their silence reminds us that history preserves continuity more easily than it preserves meaning. We can recover genes, bones, tools, and dates, but not the full inner worlds of those who lived through the transition. We do not know what names they used for themselves, how they understood strangers, or whether they recognized another kind of human as fundamentally different. We should not place modern categories inside that silence simply because the emptiness invites them. The most honest conclusion is therefore also the most human. Neanderthals were neither monsters blocking our path, nor failed versions of ourselves. They were another humanity, close enough to share ancestry with us, and different enough to carry a history that ended before writing could preserve it. Their loss was not only biological but cultural, ecological, and historical, removing memories and possibilities that no descendant could recover. Their disappearance reduced the number of human ways of being alive on Earth, even as fragments of their ancestry continued within the people who remained. And one question is left for us. If the humanity that survived still carries the humanity that vanished, what did Europe truly witness when one population disappeared and another remained?